Hi, and welcome to the live session on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data analysis applications in healthcare. I'm Perry Richmond. I'm the co-founder and vice president of marketing customer strategy for Inspire Global Ventures. Our purpose is to bridge corporates and early stage technologies through an AI-enabled technology platform, set of services, and a fund. I'm joined by two esteemed panelists. One is Elliott Green, the CEO and co-founder of Dandelion Health AI, as well as Luke Malenga, who's the COO of Data Biologistics. The goal for the next 45 minutes to an hour is to dialogue, to engage with you, engage with each other, to learn. And ideally, everyone will take away a nugget of value and have an opportunity to ask questions and really press on each of us. Please do post your questions in the chat, and we will definitely queue them as we go. So the more questions, the merrier. And with that, let's get started. So in starting off, both Elliott and Luke, if you can do a 45-second rapid describing yourself or introducing yourself, describing your company, its purpose, and how you're using or applying AI to achieve goals and/or accelerate progress in healthcare. Elliott, why don't you start?
Thanks very much, Perry, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. So my name's Elliott Green. I actually started way back when in finance, of all things, in investment banking, JP Morgan, transitioned into US healthcare with a company called Oscar Health in New York, where I was for a number of years, running kind of expansion strategy and a number of different strategic partnerships. And then was fortunate enough to get experience alongside that at TrialSpark and Clarify to kind of really see life sciences and enterprise data. So that all led me to the world of AI with my co-founders, Sendhil Mullainathan and Niyam Gandhi. And Dandelion Health, we're in an early stage. What we're doing is we're partnering with health systems to create probably the country's largest AI training data set specifically for healthcare. The goal being to facilitate, this kind of improved and far more rapid development and hopeful adoption of AI, something I know we'll be discussing in the next hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elliott, and thanks, Perry, for the introduction. My name is Luke Malenga. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Data Biologics. And Data Biologics is a startup that was founded by three physicians who are practicing orthopedic regenerative medicine. And the three of them created the company out of a frustration of the lack of available data and the lack of a good platform for collecting data in their field. And so Data Biologics makes it really simple for physicians to collect data on their treatments. So diagnosis and treatment information, and then our focus is really on patient-reported outcomes. So collecting information directly from the patient on the success of their treatment, whether that's safety data or efficacy data, questions on their function and their pain levels over time. And so we've been working now with over 60 physicians across the country and helping them to collect data on their various treatments. Our focus right now is in orthopedics and specifically in this field of regenerative medicine. And it's a growing field where there's a lot of hype, but there's also bad actors who are out there kind of muddling this field that has this potential. And so our goal is to use this data to determine, what are the best treatments for which patients, and to leverage that in the future in order to improve patient care for people with orthopedic conditions.
Thank you so much, Luke. And let's pull on that thread in terms of avoiding the bad actors and really increasing integrity as well as adoption. So Luke, you're on the implementation side of AI-enabled software and really implementing without disruption. And Elliott, you're really looking at ways for organizations to look beyond the surface of data and pull out additional insights that are truly game-changing and actionable. What factors are influencing the ability to adopt and or accelerate the rollout or implementation, or accelerating and or stopping the use of greater data analytics and or pulling insights from data. And we can pull that from the provider perspective, the caregiver perspective, the technology company perspective. You can take it from the perspective of your choice.
Yeah, just to start, I think one of the biggest things we focus on is the practical aspects of the implementation of this type of software. And so when you talk about collecting data, you're talking about an extra piece of work that someone in a clinical setting is going to have to do. In most cases, now we've evolved to the place where almost every physician, every clinic and every hospital system is using an EHR and EMR. And so with that, there's a lot of data that's being collected. But then the actual use of that data is where it becomes trickier. And I think that's the piece where a lot of physicians and even a lot of researchers within healthcare organizations struggle, because actually making use of that data is a whole different challenge than collecting it in the first place. And so one of the things that we focus on is making it really simple and structured, the collection of that data. So the entry of that data is super simple for someone like a medical assistant or a clinical staff or a research coordinator to do. So then on the back end, when it comes to analyzing this data, and something that I think Elliott's company focuses more on, which is the actual application and analysis of big data sets, becomes easier because you've done so in a structured way and you've actually collected that data. One of the things that we talk about a lot is if it's great to try to collect as much data as possible, but it's not useful unless it's structured in a way that can actually be analyzed. And it also isn't helpful to try to collect too much data and then end up with nothing. And I think that's something that we've seen a lot in these different organizations is they're interested in collecting data because there's so much out there and there's so much possible from collecting patient data, diagnostic information, lab testing, scans, things like that. But then actually making use of that data becomes more challenging if you don't have some sort of strategy for that. So we've started out simple, collecting the key pieces of information, and then the hope is to kind of build from there, as things go on.
Elliott, how about you?
Yeah, so I think I'd kind of think of it in three buckets. There's the, let's call it the data extraction, storage, use, analysis, that kind of data bucket. There's an operationalization aspect to it of just, to Luke's point, once you've got an insight, what do you do with it? How do you think about it? And then finally, kind of the payment side of things. I think, this is a very nascent industry and not everyone's necessarily worked out how to navigate the complicated healthcare kind of trip down who eventually is incentivized to pay for whatever insights you actually create. On the data side, I think it's interesting. There are pockets, as with everything in healthcare, it's very much the same describing or descriptive adjectives of, it's siloed, there's lots of data here, it's vertical, it's horizontal, but it's not deep, et cetera, et cetera. Where we definitely have pockets of success are areas like radiology, where you can just get to slightly more simple data structures of kind of a scan and a note. And that will lead you to some kind of clinical decision support in terms of is it a fracture, is it a break? I think it becomes a lot more complicated when you start swaying outside, going outside of that, and you're starting to try and work out, well, what's the link between this fracture and future injury, or really the term prediction is the key here, and that's where AI separates itself. So I think that's one side of things. I don't think we've cracked the nut of how to get enough data in a format that allows for that kind of predictive element across multivariables. In terms of the operationalization, what's interesting is I think Luke mentioned this, healthcare systems or any kind of organization within healthcare, it's a very complicated organism. If you are selling into a provider, and certainly a health system, you could be dealing with thousands of people that need to have process changes. And so the idea that, you would just give a radiologist an insight and they would, let's say on possible cardiac arrest in the future, and they would immediately know whom to contact, how to deal with it, how to deal with the patient, it's just not realistic. So, understanding where to deploy your insight is so key. And then finally, I think on the payment side, who is incentivized to pay for it? If I can predict kidney disease 12 months earlier than the market, than a system or a physician currently can, well, who wants to know? The patient, sure, right? Of course, and I think this comes to your point, Perry, of like, who are the advocates for what's going on? But the patient really has no voice in this. I mean, we could get into a longer debate about healthcare and the patient, but that's clearly a theme. So, who is it going to be? Is it going to be pharma? Is it going to be the providers? Is it going to be the payers? Who of the big actors are incentivized? Well, for payers, it depends. How long is this person going to be in my member? How incentivized am I to find something that's wrong with them and pay for them to get treatment now so as to avoid a costly episode for them in the future? For the provider, well, I could pay for this, but then am I going to get reimbursed by the payer, for anything? And then finally, on the life sciences side, of course, pharma is incentivized if there's a treatment that would cause, an uptick in sales. So understanding all of those elements is tricky. And I think, when you say kind of why haven't things moved forward or what are some of the barriers, those are kind of the three big areas that I think of.
So let's press on what you both said just a little bit. So we know that there are a series of challenges and obstacles that most healthcare institutions have a data and AI plan in place, yet many haven't operationalized it. What's it going to take to get the data that's needed, to get the insights that's needed from the data? Is it really honing in on who the payer is and who the data is valuable to? Is it the integrity and having the right structures in place, like Luke, you had mentioned? Is it the ability to process vast amounts of data very, very quickly? Or is it purely skills and capability and, healthcare providers and or other institutions having the knowledge set and the skill base to be able to extract and apply the data? So what's it going to take? If you had a magic wand, two things, what would it take to create change quickly?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, one of the biggest barriers is actually more on the practical side, and actually getting that buy-in from physicians and from the hospital administrators and all of that. I don't think it's a question of whether the technology is there. I think we're there in terms of, if we had this data set, then we could create actionable insights from there. I think it's more so about how can we convince or how can we demonstrate to those industry players, so whether it's a physician, whether it's a research coordinator, someone in that healthcare system, that this data is going to be valuable and that they should spend the time to collect it. I think that's one of the things that we emphasize a lot, is that you need the buy-in from the clinic. We're working with individual clinics, and for them, this is an added step for them to have to do. They have to collect this data, and why? I think that's a big question to answer, is why am I collecting this data? And some of those answers, like Elliott said, are still not there yet. It's going to take the collection of this data and then the analysis to see what kind of decision support it can actually provide. But there are some things already there. We say, if you collect this data, specifically when we're looking at what Data Biologics is doing in our field, if you collect this data, you're going to be able to demonstrate safety and efficacy, and that's hugely valuable. And so we're communicating that to the providers for why they should want to collect data. And I think, to your point as well, Perry, the patients, while unfortunately, like Elliott mentioned, they might not have as much of a voice as they should in their actual care. I think a lot of these data systems can actually help them to have more of a voice. And that's one of our focuses with patient-reported outcomes, is how can we bring that to the forefront? So how can we bring the patient responding on their pain and their function levels and their mental health, put that in front of the physician so that data is clearly there for them. And they're taking that patient's perspective into account. more than maybe they have been in the past.
So really good answer, actually, Luke. And I think what's so interesting about what you're talking about is there's kind of two ways you imagine change, right? There's this like almost push-pull. And I think on the physician side, there are these pockets like you've found in regenerative medicine where the physicians are pulling the solution in. There's almost this kind of, they're motivated to find out, what the solution they can implement is. And I think if you get enough of those pockets, eventually you can kind of create meaningful change across the spectrum. But that can be very hard, not impossible. Just there's then that aspect of, well, what if we looked further upstream and you looked more at institutional change, and what's it going to take to get institutional change across the, let's say just for now, the provider focus, since we're kind of there. And that's obviously where Dandelion is very interested. So, we think that there is an opportunity. Why haven't you seen, Perry, to your point, why don't you walk into a physician office and feel like there's some form of AI that is helping your healthcare, right? To your point, Luke, it kind of, the tools exist. There are pockets of the data. What's going wrong, right? And I wish I could choose one of the, or two of the 19 reasons you laid down, Perry. I can't. I wish I could try, but it's kind of, as classic in healthcare, it's a culmination of almost all of them, right? But there's some element where we believe one of the biggest barriers is if you look at, let's say, radiology AI already, you come back to that example because it is kind of computer vision has been one of the quickest things to be adopted. It is already being used behind the scenes, right? Many hospital systems have already implemented, the AI algorithm that's reading x-rays. So it's not like that's not happening. No patient knows about it, and possibly never will. But what else would you need to do to get them to implement different things? Well, there aren't actually that many products. Where are the companies that exist that are solving all of these problems? Sure, Google will come out with a paper every now and then on something that they've been looking at, but and there are successful startups already like Viz and some of the others that focus on this. But for the amount of money that you mentioned that that's going into this space, it doesn't feel as though that is also then leading to the kind of change that one would expect based on the input. So I do think that there is an aspect of how do you enable the market for success? What does that mean? And to us, that thought is, well, the data is there, but the data is not there in a format, and I think you mentioned this, Luke, it's not really there in a format or a structure that actually enables meaningful development right now. And so that's one of the biggest ways that we'd love to see, this industry change.
So there's so many directions that this can take just from your really meaningful comments in terms of, one, how does patient education change with the use of data, or the increased availability and usage of data? So very interested in that. Going through my mind was the whole idea of incentives for quality data as well as the use of data. However, Elliott, you then came through and sort of threw a curveball over to me and said, it's not necessarily, maybe not the incentives to use, because providers are using AI where it's available. It's the solutions and the availability of solutions. So going down that solutions path just for a second, in 2020 and early 2021, there's no other industry that's received more investor funding than healthcare. And I mean, it was over $3 billion in investment into health-related technologies. So what are investors seeing that maybe providers and others aren't seeing? And then what can be done to ensure the effective use of funds so that it can accelerate adoption?
Luke, you want to take this one or shall I?
Yeah, I'll start off quickly. I think in general, particularly in the US, the healthcare sector, it lags behind every other sector of commercial industry. And so I think when we're talking about some of these conversations about AI and machine learning, these are things that have already been implemented across the board, whether it's in finance or in retail or in all these other industries. And now we're finally getting to that point where this is more of a practical application in the use of healthcare data. So I think that's one of the reasons why now we're seeing this kind of explode. And certainly, as you mentioned, with COVID, there's been additional fundings for these certain technologies, because I think people realize the potential of them. You've seen different devices that have come out that can be really amazing in the way that they're able to predict someone's symptoms based off of heart rates or EKGs and things like that. And so when that comes to the forefront, when healthcare comes to the forefront of people's minds, I think that's when you start to see this rise in maybe investment interest in that industry.
There was I can't remember when I read it, but there was a great quote from Bill Gates. It was something along the lines of, people overestimate the impact of some technology over the next 2 years and underestimate it over the next 10. And that really rings true for this particular sector. I think, to Luke's point, there's an incredible amount of use of AI already in other areas. Finance is particularly good at this in terms of fraud detection and the amount of kind of social determinants it's pulling in, and how it's really predicting, certain behaviors that people probably don't even realize is happening. I think people are naturally looking at the largest industry in the country, looking at the capabilities of AI and saying, well, it's got to happen at some point. It seems like a pretty reasonable conclusion. And then to Luke's point, there's so much data generated, and we have no idea what kind of insights it could give. Vital signs in an ICU, the EKG that Luke mentioned, we're just looking at it for cardiac issues. Well, what if there's something there on kidney? What if there's something there on stroke? Who knows what kind of levels of signal an algorithm could pick up? At the moment, that kind of multivariate, to come back to it, that kind of multivariate, analysis isn't possible. So there's a kind of fundamental problem in terms of getting hold of the data to understand that potential. Really most of that lives in kind of the health system, because that's where the longitudinality actually is, despite our kind of segmented healthcare sector. So I think investors are smart to be looking at this, obviously. I wouldn't want to judge it too early, but I definitely don't think that we're seeing necessarily the speed of adoption, or at least the speed of creation that one would hope for. And so maybe, you'll kind of look back at this in a couple of years and realize that there are a few fundamental building blocks that needed to be put into place.
So interesting.
I also think even just recently, you made me think of some of the barriers that have kind of been stripped away, even just in the past few months. The anti-information blocking provisions of the 21st Century Act now allow patients and anyone that they allow access to receive the data from that is stored in these EMRs. So finally, for the first time, I think some of the legislation is starting to catch up with the availability of data. And your other point is also that, we now have this influx of data, and then how do we make sense of it? How do we use it? And I think it's important to take a step even further back and say, well, even 10, 15 years ago, no one used an EMR in a healthcare setting. No one even had a smartphone where they could collect all this information, from wearables data. That just happened in the past, 5, 10 years. And so when we talk about the speed of this technology, increasing, I think that's when you say, wow, then it makes sense that there's this growth of interest in this field, because now there is so much data. And to Elliott's point, now it's about how can we use this data and leverage it to actually, help improve care. And I think when you see that potential, that becomes really, really intriguing.
Sure. Let's put a pin for now in the changes needed in health systems to unlock the data, as well as legislation, the state of legislation, as well as required changes. Both interesting topics. We've had a question, and I want to segue into it. A number of years ago, as AI was beginning to flourish, it's very interesting to hear you say that healthcare is behind, and that finance and other industries have really accelerated the pace faster than healthcare. Early researchers, I remember being at a conference at MIT listening to breakthrough research on AI and how healthcare was used as an example. It was a radiology example of how AI can help increase productivity, but take away the fear of automation because you ultimately can't replace doctors. So it's interesting that healthcare has quote unquote fallen behind, given that it was used as such an early example of how to take some of the fear out of automation. And so we've received a question about what are your thoughts on machine learning and machine learning usage in research institutions?
So research institutions are actually kind of leading the way in this field. It's more like the commercial use cases are ones that are falling behind. There are a lot, there's a lot of research going on, whether it's, sepsis in ICUs and the data being used there to ensure that, you can kind of predict that. Whether, I think there was a recent piece about kidney failure from MRIs. So there's a lot of work in academic circles that are, and one of my co-founders is involved in this space as an academic, of looking at certain pockets of healthcare and being able to extract that relevant data and then being able to achieve some great insights. And Google itself is coming out obviously with a lot of kind of academic or research-led papers. What's interesting is it just hasn't necessarily been able to be applied at scale. So these pockets of insights are particularly useful, but we just haven't seen that kind of translate into, and to Luke's point, I long for the day that someone walks into a physician's, office or anything along those lines, any kind of healthcare provision, and says, oh, do you not have the latest X? And there's some feeling of that pull factor that you were talking about. But that's a long journey from the research side to the commercialization side, and hopefully one that we'll see kind of that bridge being filled or void being filled quickly.
Yeah, and I think another piece here, I think this kind of answers the question a little bit, is the implications of machine learning and AI. And there was a recent article, and I forget where this was, but it was surrounding COVID patients, and that the hospitals and the institutions were using artificial intelligence to help to determine which patients should receive care first. And so it seemed like a really great tool because it could help make decisions really quickly that maybe a physician who was running around or a nurse who was running around couldn't make as well in the heat of the moment, using this data that was being collected. The questions became surrounding, is that ethical for those decisions to be made without a patient even knowing that some of these AI or machine learning systems are being used? And I think, to Elliott's point, a lot of these systems are being used in the healthcare space behind the scenes most of the time. And from my perspective, I think it's important to actually draw back that curtain a little bit and to engage patients more in these decisions that are being made, even if they're being made by a computer or a machine. Because the same way that a patient expects their physician to explain to them the decisions that he's making, I think we should expect that from a machine or a computer that's also making those decisions. Obviously, the computer might not be the one, explaining to the patient, but that's, again, to your point, Perry, why the physician and the doctor still remains crucial in this equation. And I think we shouldn't forget that. A machine's not going to show empathy. A machine's not going to show compassion, but a physician will. But if a physician can use these tools to help make better decisions, and then focus more on listening to the patient and providing care to that patient, I think that's a huge win for healthcare. Really getting it back to a point of patient-centric and then personalized, because we're talking about the use of data to make decisions, personalized and patient-centric care.
So I'm going to turn one of your philosophical questions back around on you, Luke, and Elliott, please jump on in. Is it ethical to use for physicians to use data to make decisions without patients' knowledge?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question, and I try to think of it from my perspective. So if I was a patient going in and you know, a physician's making X, Y, and Z decision based off of what some computer is telling them, does that bother me? And maybe I don't know that that's happening, or maybe I do know because they informed me. And is one better or is one worse? I don't really know the answer to that, and I think with that, it's an individual decision. And I think we're still grappling with what does that mean that a computer is making a decision for me? And someone could explain it and say, well, actually, this computer is crunching a bunch of numbers that the human brain would never be able to do. And it's able to find an answer to that. And I think that's a really great thing. And I think that's super powerful. You know, that's the whole premise of an AI system. But at the same time, I think there's a comfort level that maybe isn't there yet. And so, as an individual, I might say, actually, I'd rather this physician who went to school for this and studied this, I'd rather them make the decision rather than a computer making that decision. Obviously, though, if it can be supported by what a computer is recommending to them, based off of like a bunch of data, that's super important. Because I think people will be surprised too. There are a lot of things that physicians do in healthcare right now that aren't rooted in data and aren't rooted in evidence. And so I think data and AI is a way for us to get back to a more scientific decisions based off of more relevant information. But again, I think that needs to still be interpreted by a physician. And I do think it should be explained to a patient, kind of what's happening there and what that decision-making process was.
It's interesting. I was listening to that and I was thinking, well, when you make a physician appointment and they often ask, well, you say you're seeing a specialist, have you seen anyone else? Can you give me their inevitably ends up being fax number? Maybe not everyone realizes that what happens is the front office, the specialist that you're going to see faxes over to the previous physician, asks for the records, gets the data, and then uses that as an input into making a decision. To some degree, it's been going on for decades. Is it so different? And also there's a very clear distinction between a decision being made by a computer and an input to a physician's decision being a computer or an algorithm, to be precise. And, we're nowhere near, the space where the FDA is starting to approve predictive diagnosis merely done by a machine in the majority of cases. What this is a tool just for clinical decision support. Is there something you could have missed? Should I have looked at something that I didn't think of, in my own algorithm, i.e. known as the human brain? And so, to some degree, I think the government kind of already legislated on this in terms of the amount of data that's allowed to be shared between providers, and the point of doing that in order to, make sure that the care that the patient receives is as good as possible. I think that's just a continuation of this. I think different matter when we start talking about the FDA and approvals and purely machine-driven, decision-making. But for now, that's not where we are on a scalable level.
So we've received a comment, just pressing a little bit, Elliott, on what you were saying about appointments and decisions on who gets treated. So using AI for making decisions on who gets treated is just as ethical as in clinical trials where decisions on who gets placebo are made. So can you respond or offer an opinion on that?
I don't know if I accidentally mentioned something about choosing treatments or from appointments. That was not my intention. I was just talking about data that is received when people get it. In the world of clinical trials and choosing placebos, I'm probably over my head in terms of being able to specifically go into that and how an algorithm would decide what the control group is or how it wants to choose it. To some degree, it's meant to be a random process as done now. So one would hope that it was a random process, even if a machine is involved. I have no idea why that would change. But as I said, it's probably not my area of expertise on the specificity of choosing a control group.
I think also the difference there is when you're in a clinical trial, you're aware you're in a clinical trial and you're informed that you might be getting a placebo or you might be getting a real treatment. So yes, you're making a decision about whether or not this person should receive the actual treatment versus a placebo, but you're well aware that that's what you've kind of been enrolled in. And I agree with Elliott. I don't think there's a difference between a machine that's deciding that or whether it's someone rolling dice to decide, which patient gets which treatment or which placebo.
So one thread that's come through in the last several points of discussion really are around FDA regulation, enabling or prohibiting legislation. What does the regulatory environment look like today for the data usage and the use of machine learning? And what needs, in your opinion, what needs to change, what needs to be considered and or discussed from a legislation and or a regulatory standpoint in order to ensure that there's good ethics in place and integrity, yet at the same time improve and strengthen patient care?
I mean, this one's very hard for the FDA. This is an industry that's moving, pretty quickly, and probably we haven't discussed, just due to Luke and I not being as involved in this space, life sciences. And honestly, life sciences has been kind of in this space a lot longer than perhaps some of the other aspects of healthcare. And you look at stuff like real world evidence, being submitted to the FDA in terms of trials, and they've been adapting exceptionally quickly to understanding a lot of that and trying to make sure that they're kind of taking all of the benefits, because there are huge benefits from being able to analyze and collect that much data without people having to go through the inconvenience of clinical trials. And more importantly, not to get into clinical trials too much, but I think everyone's aware of quite how hard it is to recruit and quite how inefficient that process is. So, anything that we can do to speed up safely getting more treatments to patients is something to be applauded. I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about the representativeness of data, which hasn't really been at the forefront necessarily thus far, but of what is an appropriate number, what's the right sample set. I mean, to some degree, you're mirroring the 1,500 people in a phase 3 trial. Is that sufficient? And I don't want to get into that, that's not my place, but there's a great opportunity with so much data to make sure that there's a really robust capability of assessing kind of a far more representative set of people, to make sure that if you are releasing therapies or treatments or approving new medical devices, you're doing it on a far wider spectrum than possibly has been done before, because you've gone digital rather than offline. And there are great benefits there that I think the FDA is aware of, and they're definitely working towards facilitating.
Yeah, Elliott, I think you're 100% right. I think, the FDA has come around in their acceptance of real world evidence. And it is something that we're involved in as well. It's not our primary focus. Our primary focus is providing software for physicians to collect data. But there's also this interest in how can we speed up an FDA approval process for some of these device or what the FDA might consider drugs in the space of regenerative medicine and orthobiologics, and doing so in a way, obviously, that still ensures safety and efficacy. But in the field that we're operating in, it's actually very interesting. There's a lot of physicians who are performing these treatments in the real world in practice. And so our premise is, why wouldn't you collect the data on that and then submit that or provide that to the FDA or to an agency to demonstrate safety and efficacy? So, if you're going to be doing these treatments, which right now, again, in this really specialized world of regenerative medicine, there's, I guess, a lot of ambiguity on what's allowed and what needs approval and what doesn't need approval and what's considered a device versus a drug and things like that. But at the very least, if you're going to be offering patients these treatments, you should be collecting data on that for a multitude of reasons. One, so that patient is able to see that you're looking at these procedures and you're tracking the efficacy and the safety. But also to your point on real world evidence, so that then you can have this large set of data that demonstrates perhaps, the safety and efficacy to a regulatory body. Again, the questions become, is that data representative? Does it include a large enough sample size and those type of things? And that falls more on someone who's a statistician or someone who's making those type of decisions. But I think it's really intriguing to think about how we can expedite this concept of a clinical trial and maybe do it in a way that's more representative. Because in a clinical trial, you're excluding individuals, obviously. That's the nature of a clinical trial, is to fence it around this group and determine that it does work for this set of people. That doesn't necessarily reflect the real world. And so, a big premise of ours is, let's collect this real world evidence. It's messier, it surrounds a lot more people, but then if you can start drawing conclusions from that large data set, that potentially can be more valuable than a clinical trial that just demonstrates efficacy for a set group of people, that excludes women who are pregnant or people of a certain age, et cetera.
So we were talking about submitting real world data to the FDA for their evaluation. So Elliott, this isn't an elegant description of the question. However, what kinds of challenges and or flaws are there in submitting data when we haven't even scratched the surface of existing data? So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a really interesting question, actually, because it kind of, to some degree, comes to how clean is your data, which in healthcare, one of people's favorite conversations is, oh, healthcare data is filthy, dirty, very hard, lots of missingness, etc. I don't want to get too much into the different sources and their like high fidelity value, shall we say, but there is definitely opportunity for consensus on what constitutes, whether it's cleaning algorithms to make sure that certain data sets go through exactly the same process, so at least there is commonality in terms of the data that is being submitted. The FDA, to my understanding, will not let you submit data unless you have also submitted a cleaning algorithm to justify the data that you have collected, because of the nature of how hard it is to collect data. Now that's more for real world evidence, obviously, than necessarily clinical trials that are specifically run, where there are very tight protocols on how that data is collected and then submitted. But I do think that there is a huge challenge on how many is enough. Like, what is the appropriate number of data points needed to approve something we have never done before? Like, that is a fascinating question. I personally don't know the answer, but there's some kind of gut reaction. Is it 500? No, that seems too small. Is it 1,000? No, probably not. Is it 10,000? Maybe. Is it representative? Do we have enough men, women, different colors, different types of socioeconomic backgrounds? Like, what are we looking at in terms of the overall population? I think there is a lot of work to be done there, but I think that's exciting, because if we can come to some kind of consensus, or at least an evolving consensus, I'm sure it'll end up being, that does open the doorway for so many new treatments or so many products and insights to kind of be able to enter healthcare.
So Elliott, you started to go down this path in terms of diversity in the data and ensuring a level of diversity in data. When you talk about submitting clean algorithms, knowing that bias in AI, as well as diversity in clinical trials, addressing health disparities, and the whole social equity conversation is there. How do you reconcile both the desire not to have bias in the algorithm and the need to increase diversity and submit a clean algorithm? How do you reconcile that?
Well, I have to be careful on the answer to this one, because Sendor, who's my co-founder, has written think a number of times on diversity within AI algorithms. So I refer people to his work for a much more academic viewpoint. At a very fundamental level, you know, a lot of this is about the data, the scale and size. You know, if you put a biased data set into the problem to begin with, you will more than likely have a biased algorithm at the end of that analysis. So, you know, that's one of the key reasons why we looked at, you know, how do we create a data set that is large enough, diverse enough, not just in terms of, you know, whether it's racial diversity or socioeconomic diversity, also even things like machines. You know, radiology, number of different machines are used. You know, are we making sure that, you know, we have examples from everything so that when we apply this new product, it is safe to apply on the Siemens, the Fuji, whatever else may be used, right? What about care practices? What happens in an academic medical center is often very different to what may happen in a community hospital, just because of the nature of that workflow, those processes, right? Some of it's regulatory, some of it's institutional. So diversity has a lot of different elements to it. And I think it's important that you are able to capture data from enough examples of that to try and avoid that, you know, that end product being too influenced by diversity issues.
That's really interesting in terms of both visible and invisible diversity as far as types of care facilities, as well as diversity in machines. One topic that's been pretty consistent across the discussions today, as well as we know the number one most material issue across life sciences and healthcare is social determinants of health and increasing access to care in underserved communities in the US and beyond. How can the use of technology and or AI enablement of technology help to remove some of these barriers? And how can you imagine a future where technology is playing a greater role?
Well, I think, you know, Elliott can probably answer this question better because of his focus on the actual AI implementation of these things. But on one hand, it comes down to knowing what the issues are. And so by collecting this data, it allows you to start to understand what factors are actually impacting maybe someone's outcome of their care. And what's interesting is we're collecting a lot of these things already. When a patient comes in and does an intake form, they're often, you know, putting what their address is and what their occupation is and different things like that. And so, you know, those social determinants then in turn, when paired with the care that's provided to them and what their outcome is, can maybe help to determine which of those, again, you know, to Elliott's point earlier, because there's so many factors, this becomes very challenging. But trying to figure out which of those factors actually do impact someone's care and the care they receive, but also the outcome of that care based on maybe some of these social determinants. And something that's really interesting, actually, there's been some research looking at patient-reported outcomes, you know, not done by us personally, but that's out there that suggests that one huge factor for a patient's outcome after a surgery is whether or not they're married or have someone to take care of them at home. And that's something that you don't necessarily directly think about when you're thinking about what's their health in terms of you know, any pre-existing conditions and things like that. But it's a super important factor and maybe one of the most important factors. Again, there needs to be a lot more research on it. But I think it's important to not ignore all these other pieces of an individual and just focus in on the diagnostics. And I think data and AI allows us to do that because we are collecting, like I said, a lot of this information, but it's about putting that to use and then determining which of these factors actually do impact someone's care. And then making change, you know, from that. So if you realize that there's certain individuals in certain environments that do poorly, then what can we do to fix that? And I think that's, you know, that's when we get to a place of providing more equitable care across the board.
Yeah, I totally agree, Luke. I probably, to use like a very specific example, which I think, based on the breadth of your answer may be helpful as well. Take something like transport. It's a classic. Should we be sending Ubers out to people to get them to appointments? Well, the world just went through or is still going through one of the largest, experiments in changing the delivery of healthcare to, certainly the US to being far more virtual. And as people say, kind of taking care to the patient rather than forcing the patient to come to care. And so it's going to be fascinating to see, what were the results, what were the outcomes to this, last 16, 18 months, and hopefully not long into the future. But, is there meaningful change? People have already been working on this question for many years, and I think have had very interesting insights on, being able to bring patients to the physician. I think what's great now is that physicians had to go outside for some of them, and some of them already were doing it, possibly outside of their kind of routine, and deliver care virtually. And so how much will this help different areas, different aspects of society where people struggle to get to appointments? Will suddenly this kind of triage level go virtual and be able to cause like a much more efficient healthcare journey for people that previously couldn't even start it by getting to the PCP or getting to urgent care and not being able to speak to a telemedicine advisor or doctor because they didn't understand how to reach them? Maybe now, we'll see all of that. So I think social determinants of health have been brilliant in terms of highlighting those aspects rather than just having one large blob, obviously, that says patients, conditions, now being able to understand those nuances. And I think already the good works have started. We'll probably just continue from here.
We'll end with the virtual care and changes we will see as a result of COVID. To summarize, what I'm hearing is that there is really an opportunity to use data to really pinpoint what factors influence care, what can be done to address as a result, and then ensure that we're understanding related nuances so that we can drive to solutions. Very quickly before we end on our post-COVID question, we did have a question submitted, which is, could you elaborate on HIPAA issues, if any, for AI, machine learning, data analytics in healthcare or digital health?
So I'll talk about it from our perspective. We only deal with de-identified data. We'll go through a safe harbor to make sure that we're doing that because we don't want to, we don't think there's any need to have PHI for what needs to occur. Our goal is just to create or to help others create products that will, ultimately benefit patients. And so, keeping the identity of the patient secret is key to doing that, to make people feel comfortable that their data is not being used in a more targeted fashion, but that ultimately the outcomes are going to be beneficial, whether they do or don't have a condition or, their loved ones may or may not. Outside of that, I don't have a tremendous amount to say. I think there's been some bad press of, the use of patient data. I think there have been some question marks against some of the institutions that have not historically been healthcare focused, having very large amounts of healthcare data of an identifiable nature, and whether or not that is something that patients want, because they can't necessarily directly see the benefit to them of having those kinds of institutions have that data alongside all the other data that they may hold. But Luke mentioned being a patient. I would say, putting my personal hat on, if you told me that the information was being utilized in such a way so that my care would truly be improved, over the next decade, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it may be, it's hard not to be in favor of doing that. As long as you are not going to start, creating impediments by trying to find people that you should punish for unfortunately through no fault of their own becoming sick.
Great point. Good, thank you. We are running down on time, and what would love to do is end on a double-ended question or double-sided question, one of which is, what is the future of technology and AI and data analytics look like post-COVID, with the biggest changes in healthcare delivery in our lifetime? And what closing or final thoughts or call to action do you have for the group that's listening and engaging?
Well, I'll go back to something Elliott said, where he described, a patient walking in and some sort of AI decision-making support being used to help to guide their care. I think we're getting to that point, and that's going to happen very quickly. And I think you see that through a number of new healthcare companies, Carbon Health, Hinge Health, that are out there that are providing care that's based off of AI, and also maybe is paired with telehealth. And that's, in my perspective, where we've shifted. And I think it's going to come even quicker. I think of it from my understanding, as a millennial, and the way that we see the world, in that we're looking for healthcare in a different way than I think older generations have, in that we expect it to be rooted in data, because we're so used to that across all the things that we do, and we're expecting it to be personalized because that's the way that we shop and do other things. Healthcare is very particular, and I don't think that we should shop for healthcare the same way we shop for shoes. But I do think there are a lot of possibilities for healthcare to become more personalized, and also for the individual to be more empowered to make their own care decisions because they have access to data. So that's, I think, my answer to probably both of those pieces there.
Thank you. And Elliott, in our last 30 seconds, go for it.
I'll cram it all in, Perry. Since it's so little, I would just say one sentence. I think that it needs to be responsible and sustainable creation and deployment of AI. I think we're at a nascent stage of what will be a huge trend for many years to come. And I think there's a lot of trust that needs to be built through that. And hopefully all of the people involved in this industry will do that.
Great. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughtful commentary today.
Thanks, Perry.
Thanks, Perry. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you.